Hello everyone, welcome back to another character Bible study in Shady Oak Ministries. Today we're going to be discussing the character from Attack on Titan known as Hanji Zoe. Now, if you could join me in the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 4, in verse 18 we're going to read about the Christian implications to how Hanji's character was presented. 2 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 18. While we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. This bears some similarity to Hanji's description of why she had taken a different perspective on viewing the Titans than that of her comrades. To which she is saying, and I quote from episode 15 of season 1 of the series on Attack on Titan. Yes, I do have to specify which season now. She said this: I considered that maybe the things that we see are not the things which are actually there. I tried fighting the Titans out of hatred for decades. Now I want to try looking at them from a different point of view than everyone else. It might prove to be futile, but I'll do it. Now, understand that with these two quotes being compared side by side, this is going to be the basis of how we're going to approach this study. And for all intents and purposes, understand, Hanji was always the oddball, as well as my favorite character in Attack on Titan ever. But she understood and approached the Titans as people. And among other things, she was kind of the Wanda Wonka of the group. Always kind of out there, and especially considering the group that she was in, that's saying something. She consciously approached things that have and continue to be a threat to her life as well as the lives of others. And as well, she approaches these things without fear. But the most significant thing about Hanji Zoe's approach to the Titans as people was that she was right. Spoiler alert for season 2, it turns out that the Titans are people. Granted, they're trapped in a mindless state of supernatural preservation and empowerment until their human form in the nape of their neck is removed from the main body. But even before this was confirmed as true, and this is what's important, she held to it because of personal experience. She played soccer with a Titan's head and realized this should be heavier. There might be something else going on here. So, to recap all these points into what's going to form the basis of how we approach Hanji Zoe's character from a biblical perspective, first, she saw things in a way that no one else did. 2, she continued to do so in spite of the things she was looking at were still a threat to her, i.e. Sonny and Bean. But thirdly, she came to these conclusions, and here's the most important part, based on personal experience. Now, all of these things are the exact same way, well, not the exact same way, but in principle, the way the Apostle Paul, the guy who wrote 2 Corinthians that we just read, along with a third of the New Testament, became a Christian in the first place. We're going to discuss today the 3 things that motivated the Apostle Paul to become a Christian, and in the same way, how Hanji Zoe gained her perspective on the Titans. And hopefully the comparison between the two will provide some perspective on the Christian example for those of you who would consider yourselves non-Christian. And as well for my fellow brothers and sisters, hopefully this will give you a new appreciation for Hanji Zoe that you didn't have before. So in sharing this joy with you, something I am not willing to just keep to myself, we're going to discuss first the perspective of the Apostle Paul and how he approached the reality of death different from that of his peers. Secondly, we're going to discuss the perseverance of this perspective by Paul. Why did he continue to look at it this way, though death continued to, dry tongue, desert air, why do you betray me? Though death continued to take the lives of not only people throughout the world, but his fellow Christians included, people close to him. And thirdly and lastly, why this perspective that Paul took wasn't just because something broke up here one day and he decided to go to his death with it. He had a personal experience, just like Hanji Zoe. And with the basis of that being how and why you come to a relationship with God, you'll be standing on solid ground, not sinking sand. So starting with the perspective, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1 through 5. Now again, if you had a physical copy and were reading 2 Corinthians 4, this is the immediate next verse following chapter 4 and verse 18. So we're going in chronological order here. And after Paul makes the note in saying that what we see isn't necessarily what's there, though the things that we do see physically are temporary, the things that we don't see are eternal. And with that perspective in mind, he then applies it to death. He says this, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1. For we know that if our earthly house, this tent, this temporary dwelling place, is destroyed, we have a building from God. So note the comparisons here. Paul says temporary dwelling place, permanent dwelling place. And he's using this to describe our bodies. A house which is made from heaven, if indeed, a house, I skipped the line there, not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed. Now there's that terminology again. He's using these physical allusions to determine a spiritual reality. Something will be put on us. Our habitation which is from heaven. If indeed having been clothed, we shall not be found naked. When we go to heaven, we won't just be spirits floating around without a body. We'll be given a new body. For we who are in this tent groan, being burdened, not because we want to be unclothed. The Christian perspective isn't pursuit of suicide, but further clothed, that mortality may be swallowed up by life. Now he who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who has also given us the Spirit as a guarantee. This is, of course, referring to salvation. Now, understand the perspective that Paul has here. He looks at death as a very temporary enemy. In fact, he almost looks at it as an ally. Naturally, he's not going to go gung-ho into situations where he would put himself in danger. Those situations actually had a way of finding him. If you read the book of Acts, you'll know what I'm talking about. But whenever Paul approached death, he didn't do so with fear. And this struck as odd to the Greek audiences that were looking at him at that time, because understand the perspective. When a Greek looked at life, it was the best that they were ever going to get. And if they could enjoy anything physically in this world, that was all that they'd ever have, because the only type of resurrection they would have in the underworld would be, in a sense, a spiritual, ironic reflection of the good or bad deeds they did in life. And of course, there was no personal experience based on this, just stories. But the difference between the perspective that Paul took on these things was saying, no, we don't fear death, we look forward to it. Not that we look forward to death itself, but what death will produce in us. It brings us, it gives us the opportunity, rather, to not only leave the physical maladies of this world, aging, disease, grief, so on and so forth, but it brings us to heaven. It gives us a hope of knowing that what was once a cutoff from everything that we hold dear in this world is now a doorway to everything we look forward to in the next life. A Christian looks at death with confidence. In fact, during the time of Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, there was a time of plague in the Roman Empire. And a Roman philosopher looked at the Christians carrying corpses that would be piled on like the Middle Ages and the Black Plague. And he recorded historically, just completely perplexed by this, he said, the Christians, they seem to carry their dead as if in triumph. So this perspective of Christianity by Paul would certainly have come across as odd, for lack of a better term. And if you understand this is the perspective that Paul took, death was no longer a threat, though it was still an enemy. He looked at it in a way where he's saying, hey, if you get me, I'm going to a better place. I could care less if I get eaten by the Titans. What I want to know is what I can do in the meantime, how I can learn more and share more about the truth behind the reality behind death. Now, just like Hanji Zoe in her perspective of the Titans, no one else looked at the Titans as if they were people. And even before it was true, or at least confirmed as true, it always was, But Hanji took a perspective that didn't make sense to anyone else around her. But why did she hold to that perspective? Well, this is where it gets interesting, because she didn't just decide one day, oh, I'm going to start looking at the Titans as people, and then just say, well, I think this might be a fun hobby. One more way to mess with Levi and get him to just look at me with that exasperated look he gives everything else in life. But she kept looking at this. She kept looking at things this way, and for a very good reason. And before we get into the cause of that, understand as well, Paul kept to this idea even when it was inconvenient for him, even when his loved ones died. Because, in the same way, understand, the Titans were still eating Hanji's friends. And in the same way, death was still taking Paul's friends. So it was in those moments we'd have to say, okay, either put up or shut up. Do you actually believe this? And why? Well, here's the perseverance of Paul's perspective towards death. Something that we'll all have to deal with. It's a threat to us all, just like the Titans. 1 Corinthians, this is the book that he wrote before 2 Corinthians, if you don't catch the numbers. Chapter 15, and I encourage you to read the whole chapter. I'm just going to summarize it for the sake of time. But understand that this is, in a sense, Paul putting forth his credentials as to why he took this perspective. And understand as well, like we said, this was very odd for a first century Greek to hear. He makes the following points to confirm this, explaining his position. Because when you said resurrection to a Greek, it meant that you would just continue to live forever in this body. That if we look for an eternal existence, we'll continue to age, we'll continue to get more feeble and rotted until we're literally just roots in the ground with organs pumping through. And no one looked forward to that. No one wanted to be just this achy, breaky, old and feeble, push me down, I can't find my banana, to quote the theologian and comedian Brad Stein. That was how the Greek looked at the resurrection, but Paul said, no, you misunderstand my perspective. Understand not only what I mean by resurrection, but what that means for us. Our example of the resurrection is the first one to pull it off, Jesus Christ. Now note, other people have been resuscitated from death, but when Paul describes the resurrection, he's referring to the foundation of the Christian faith, that Jesus died, rose, and never died again. Now, what was that like for him? Well, first, he lays it down as not just hearsay. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 through 8, start with confirming and referencing the eyewitnesses of the resurrection. And note, he references over 500 individuals witnessing him at one time rose from the dead, communicating with them, and all confirming the same things about him. Now, this is generally when the skeptic comes in and says, well, yeah, they must have had a mass hallucination. Understand, first, that mass hallucinations historically are exceedingly rare events. And one such example of this was actually an event that took place where a group of individuals, not a large enough one to confirm this many people, but a large group of people, a sizable crowd, saw what they claimed to be all seeing the Virgin Mary descend from heaven and speaking to them. But this is actually a misrepresentation of the event. What happened was a group of individuals saw a phenomenon, and they described such a similar event that they all hallucinated various things from this bizarre event and then determined various things from it. They all didn't see the same thing. Some reported that the sun descended to the earth and spoke to them. Others said it was literally the bodily Virgin Mary talking to them. And then others just said, oh, it was just something really shiny and everyone was freaking out, and so on and so forth. This bizarre event that is, of course, not only inconsistent with Christian theology, but just not something that ever really happened. Whatever did happen, it was responded to in various ways. But when Jesus appeared to the disciples, understand the difference. They all didn't say, did you see Jesus? Yeah, I saw Jesus. Well, what did he do when you saw him? Oh yeah, he ate some bread. And he said, oh, he juggled and got on a unicycle when he did with me. No, they all said, he entered the room without using the door. Odd. He ate a specific kind of food, recorded in the Gospels. He spoke to them all the same words. If I hallucinate, then it's in my mind. As David Wood said in his debate on the resurrection, he noted, if I take a bunch of acid and then see a leprechaun, everyone else in the room isn't going to ask him for his pot of gold because the leprechaun is specifically in my mind. In the same way, Paul's making the point and saying if 500 people at once see the same thing, if 2 people at once see the same thing, if any number of people say the same thing, including to which a bunch of individuals who weren't expecting that to happen, that probably means that not only it happened, but they believed exactly what that sight was telling them. How do we know that? Well, A, not only is it very, very uncommon for many people to hallucinate the same thing, if not downright psychologically impossible, but then you have to understand each of these men went to their deaths for this being true. Coining the phrase, liars make poor martyrs. It's one thing to be told something is true and go to your death out of belief for that. It's zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. On the other hand, if you're the ones who start this belief system, if you lead the charge in saying, for no other reason, I'm going to lay down my life for the fact that I saw him die and I saw him come back to life. He promised the same to me. That's worth laying your life down for. Maybe it doesn't prove that Jesus rose from the dead, but it proved that they believed it. And if so many people saw the same thing at once, it debunks any idea of this being a fabricated event. Multiple accounted and attested eyewitnesses note these things as true. And if what they saw impacted their lives so much so that, including the Apostle Paul, they were willing to be martyred for it, it's worth considering. Now he goes on to explain, verses 9 and onward, he establishes the resurrection as the key foundation of the Christian faith, that without it our faith is pointless, and we're of most men to be pitied. Our Christian faith should be based on facts, historical facts, not feelings. As you can tell, I've taken the time to look into these things. And my fellow Christians, as well as non-Christians, should too. I want you to come to reasonable conclusions for your relationship with God. If you look in the Bible, you won't find a fanciful collection of stories like Atlas holding the earth on his shoulders, or Icarus making wings out of wax and then flying too close to the sun. You're going to read about real people and real events, including many embarrassing events that wouldn't have been recorded about them otherwise unless it was actually something that happened. But as well, among all of these other things, when we take a look at the Gospels and realize that these are just people talking about things that they actually saw, experienced, and that experience has implications for us as well, Paul's convictions start to make sense. Then he goes on to describe the implications of Jesus' promise of eternal life, that the body that we'll have will no longer age, will no longer face the physical maladies. He's critiquing the Greeks' perspective of the resurrection. He's giving himself the liberty to define his own terms, basically. He also is fair. He acknowledges the alternatives. The two most popular fields of thought in that day were Epicurean and Stoic philosophy. They were based on the teachings of the pursuit of hedonism and the pursuit of just the absence of all feelings and sensations as the true approaches to life. There was the guy who said, what feels good is good. It can't be wrong if it feels so right. That's Epicureanism. And then Stoicism is basically the guy who says, well, life's hard, then you die, bring it on, I'm no small fry. That's the logic of a Stoic individual. That's how we describe someone who's emotionless. They're very stoic. And Paul says if you take those kinds of perspectives, these are your alternatives. Eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Or if you take the other perspective and say that just the absence of all feelings, then what were you created for in the first place? Just to suffer? Of course not. Suffering is a part of our existence, but as we discussed previously in our Mikasa study, each and every one of us understand that that was something that went wrong. It's something that doesn't belong here. It's not something that we're fond of, or if we could live without it, we would. It's only here because it's there, I guess is the best way to put it. We only accept that it's here because it's there. That's what I mean. Next, he goes into how the resurrection works. He uses examples like a seed, though there's the minerals and fragments and materials that make up what will one day become a tree, which is much more different than a seed. the seed doesn't become a tree unless it's buried and dies in the ground. What was once a seed ceases to be, but everything that's in the seed then comes forth as something completely new and different. That's how he describes the resurrection. It's not that the seed is any more or less the tree, it's just the different form is capable of so much more. It lasts much longer. It's much safer and more powerful than the seed initially. That's how he describes this different kind of body produced by death. We don't enter heaven until we die. But then he also goes on to say why we as Christians should look forward to it. That the resurrection from the dead, not death itself, but the resurrection is what brings us to heaven, the fulfillment of our hope. And then, lastly, he applies it to himself. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 58. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. So, this is how Paul knew his perspective on death wasn't futile. Given all this information, death still claimed his fellow Christians, just like given all of Hanji's research, Titans were still killing their friends. But they both still looked at death with hope. In Paul's case specifically, knowing the Lord conquered it. And this is 1 Corinthians 15:55 if you want more details. Now note, the Greeks still thought he was crazy until they heard his story. That's where we bring us to the third point, personal experience. Not only did Paul have a unique perspective on death that no one else shared, just like Hanji and the Titans, not only did Paul persevere in this perspective, especially when it was difficult, just like Hanji and the Titans, but thirdly, Hanji and Paul both adopted these perspectives based on a personal experience. Acts chapter 22, verse 6. Paul's giving his testimony to a crowd of Jews that were once the kids that he grew up with. Now it happened as I journeyed, I came near Damascus at about noon. Suddenly a great light from heaven shone around me, and I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, that was his birth name, why are you persecuting me? Rather intimidated, he answered, Who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. Oh. And those who were with me indeed saw the light and were afraid, but they did not hear the voice of him who spoke to me. So this was a personal encounter that Paul was experiencing. The other guys just freaked out. So I said, What shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, Arise and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all things which you are appointed for you to do. And since I could not see for the glory of that light, being led by the hand of some of those who were with me, I came to Damascus. The light had struck him blind. Then a certain Ananias, a devout man according to the law, having a good testimony with all the Jews who dwelt there, came to me, and he stood and said to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that same hour I looked up at him, and then he said, The God of our fathers, so this is a Jew speaking to a Jew, has chosen you, that you should know his will and see the just one, and hear the voice of his mouth. For you will be his witness to all the men of what you have seen and heard. Now, why are you waiting? Arise and be baptized, and wash away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord. Now, as it happened, when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, that I was in a trance, and I saw him saying to me, Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, for they will not receive your testimony concerning me. So I said, Lord, they know that in every synagogue I imprisoned and beat those who believe on you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I also was standing by, consenting to his death. I guarded the clothes of those who were willing to kill him. And he said to me, Depart, for I will send you far from here, to the Gentiles, to the non-Jewish people. Now, let's recap that for a second. A man who once murdered Christians for a living. He was literally there selling tickets to the death of the first martyr. Then, after a personal encounter with Jesus, something that no one else shared but him. Well, did he hallucinate? Well, no, not based on the results. The proof's in the pudding, basically. What came out of this was naturally explained as from a reliable source. When he went to Damascus and met a man named Ananias, where he was told, and you can read this earlier in the book of Acts, where he would receive his sight, those things were true. It'd be odd to hallucinate something that you weren't planning on happening, first and foremost. A miraculous healing that you weren't expecting or anticipating to happen. He was, if anything else had happened on that journey to Damascus, or rather, if nothing had happened, he would have probably have lynched Ananias. And yet, this hallucination led him to someone not only willing to share the gospel with him, able to miraculously heal him, but then led him on a journey that defined the rest of his life in a very successful ministry. Now, you're not willing to take those odds as coincidence. I'm not. He was then, after a personal encounter with Jesus had blinded him, had his eyes literally opened, and he realized he had more in common with the non-Jewish people than he realized. They were both loved by the same God. And that's when he began sharing this good news with non-Jewish people. And understand that statement is significant, because that made absolutely no sense given his upbringing. Do you understand how racist the mindset of a first century Jew was? Famous quotes from Jews during this time period, during the time of the Apostle Paul and his teacher Gamaliel, and the Roman historian who was Jewish, Flavius Josephus, recorded that the consensus view of Jews was that the only reason God created non-Jewish people was to kindle the fires of hell, so that Satan will suffer more. So, obviously, a really positive outlook on the non-Jewish people. I naturally want to go out of my way and dedicate my life to sharing the gospel with them. And yet, no sooner at that time period had God personally showed up and proved the contrary, but also understand as well, this ministry to the non-Jewish people defined the rest of Paul's life, and as well got him into no shortage of trouble among his fellow Jews. The verse that immediately follows after Acts chapter 22 was that the crowd that he grew up with, the moment he said Gentiles, non-Jewish people, they started screaming, throwing dirt in the air, and said, "Kill him! Kill him!" Very sane group of people. Middle East hasn't changed, but you look at all these things and say, wow. So given his upbringing, no reason to take this perspective. Given the reality that he lived with, no reason to keep this perspective, and especially considering the facts, given the most common and widely accepted view of resurrection at that time, no reason to believe it at all, just like the Titans. But guess what? Paul took that perspective because he actually saw something. Something so significant that he was willing to let it define the rest of his life. Now, just like Hanji and the Titans, when she picked up that head, she realized something was off here. She had grown up hating and slaughtering Titans since childhood. Just like Paul, except for the Titans part, note, it was the one day that she realized she personally saw something that made her look at Titans differently. No, Paul didn't become a Christian because he kicked a Christian's head and said, "Oh my gosh, he went to heaven." No, that's not what happened. But this personal encounter, this personal experience with God was what they were willing to let define the rest of their life, and something that Paul the Apostle himself, since we're talking about reality in that case, is actually significant, given he went to his death based on him knowing that this resurrection that he spoke about was true. There was no riches. There was nothing to gain. He lost his family. He lost his credibility. He lost his position and career as a Pharisee. He had to change his name for other reasons, but granted. He lost everything. He didn't have anything to gain out of this except for one reason. Actually, two. And it's basically the same reason why Hanji took her position. And note, before I give those two reasons, understand, is Hanji crazy? Absolutely. But that's why we love her, because the kind of crazy she has was based, first, on a personal encounter, and second, a search for the truth. And if that's what makes you crazy, then her and I have that much in common. Thank you for your time and listening to this study. I hope it's been a blessing to you. If you have any sincere questions, leave them in the comments below. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, you know where to go. And most importantly, if you know someone who is a fan of Hanji's character, but perhaps hasn't looked at her from a biblical perspective before, perhaps hadn't heard of the Apostle Paul before, but has heard of Attack on Titan and would see this as a good way to bridge the gap between the two, please share this study with anyone you feel would be blessed by it. But most of all, thank you for your time to listen to this study. And once again, remember, based on the personal experience of individuals like Paul, the 12 apostles, the early century Christians, and all those throughout history to this day, they all died knowing this same fact, to which I remind you, that Jesus loves you.